Ever since the foundation of Islam in the 7th century, its caliphate seemed virtually unstoppable, quickly routing the centuries-old empires in Persia and Byzantium, and almost seizing Constantinople itself. While in the west, they pushed through Egypt and conquered the entire North African coast in less than 100 years, before seizing Hispania nearly unopposed. For a Christian in the 8th century, it looked as if the entirety of Europe would soon fall. But one battle halted this advance. A battle between the Umayyad Caliphate, arguably the strongest nation in the world at the time, and a coalition of Frankish kingdoms, who only a few years ago were fighting amongst themselves. It would be this battle in the year 732 which would cement the powers of Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, whose lineage would reshape the entirety of Western Europe, building the first Western Empire after the fall of Rome, and even being crowned its successor. In one battle, the trajectory of the Europe that we know today was built. But what if this changed? What if, on that fateful October day, the Frankish troops were crushed by the much larger Arab army, allowing for Islam to spread to France? What if Charles is killed in battle, never to gain the name Martel, nor to have his descendants dominate Europe? What if the Umayyad won the Battle of Tours? Before I start, since this scenario is in the age of antiquity and going into the medieval era, even small changes in the timeline can create massive butterfly effects due to the high importance of individual kings and nobles during this period in history, meaning this timeline will have to be less realistic and detailed than some of my other scenarios. To give some context on this time period, the Battle of Tours in 732 was part of an incursion on Aquitaine by the Umayyad Caliphate, which had just recently conquered all of Iberia except for Asturias in the north, and had been eyeing Aquitaine as its next prize. Contrary to popular belief, however, the invasion into Aquitaine, led by Abd al-Rahman, wasn't actually intended to conquer territory, as a consensus among modern historians is that this incursion was most likely just a large raid. Partially due to this, many historians also call into question whether the result of the Battle of Tours really did save the entirety of Western Europe from an Islamic takeover, as many today still believe. However, what is undeniable is that following this battle in our timeline, the Umayyads were slowly driven back, until finally Mandlan Gaul was secured in the year 759, relegating the Umayyad and subsequent Cordoba caliphates to the south of the Pyrenees, curtailing their potential to threaten mainland France. On the other side of this battle, there is also significant importance for both Francia and Aquitaine. For Aquitaine, their ruler, Duke Odo, was forced to submit his nation to the Franks in exchange for their assistance against the Umayyad, which allowed for the Franks to, in the long term, dominate the region. While for Francia, Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace, through his key role in the battle, cemented his prestige and power within the nation, allowing for his descendants like Pepin and Charlemagne to name themselves kings and dominate Europe. So with that covered, in an alternate October 732, the two armies face off against each other, in a battle which would echo through time. In this timeline, the remnants of the Aquitanian forces would not be sent to raid the Muslims' campsite, while simultaneously al-Rahman's push against the Frankish army on the 11th of October would fully pierce through the center of Charles's line. During this, Charles himself is slain, which triggers a widespread panic along Catholic lines, causing some of them to retreat, allowing for contingents of the Muslim cavalry to pursue them, while the rest of the army splits their opponent in two, causing the deaths of several thousand troops, including Duke Odo. From this point, with both of their enemies' rulers dead and their armies routed, the Umayyad forces would be free to ransack the city of Tours, and likely several others, without any significant resistance. By the end of 733, the Muslim forces would return to Hispania with their spoils, leaving the territorial sovereignty of Aquitaine unfettered for now. But despite the Muslims not seizing any territory, this did not mean that Francia and Aquitaine were secure. Only a few weeks following the decisive Battle of Tours would a massive crisis engulf the entirety of Gaul. Upon hearing the news of Charles's death at the battle, a massive tension begins in Francia over the succession. Though Charles's sons, Carloman, Pippin, and Grifo, were in our timeline able to collaborate and keep the nation together following their father's death, in this timeline, The younger and more brash sons, with less time from their father to lay out clear succession, would quickly turn against each other. It would also be in this new succession crisis where some of the vassal states of the Franks, such as the Duchy of Alemannia and Bavaria, would take the opportunity to sever their lot with the Franks. Similarly, following the death of his father, Hunald I would rise to take the throne of Aquitaine and officially redeclare independence from the rest of the kingdom. To make things even more complicated, groups of powerful nobles and potentially even the king himself may also try to rebel against Charles's sons and attempt to seize power for themselves, thus beginning the Three Brothers' War. Grifo, as an illegitimate son of Charles and thus intensely disliked by the other two brothers, would swiftly flee to the Frankish German territory, which would act as his power base, while Carloman and Pepin would seize Austrasia and Neustria respectively. Smaller and less influential groups, such as the attempts by the king and some of the northern nobility, would be quickly crushed, while in the south and Burgundy, the nobility begins to seize large swathes of territory. During this period of disunity, the Umayyad would take the opportunity to again march into Aquitaine, demanding that Hunald declare his fealty to the Caliph and convert to Islam. Hunald, already in a politically tumultuous position, with not much consolidated power, would be forced to accept their demands in order to keep his position of rulership, submitting Aquitaine to the Arabian Empire. Back in Francia proper, over the course of around 5 years, the three brothers would attempt to wrestle for control over the entire kingdom. However, with a temporary truce between the two legitimate brothers, Grifo would be the first to collapse, fleeing to his family in Bavaria. From there, Carloman and Pepin would place their focus on each other, disregarding other foes like the large noble rebellions in Neustria and the Saxon invasions into northern Austrasia. Eventually, the two brothers would face each other in a battle near the city of Soissons, where the more militarily adept Carloman would best his younger brother, imprisoning him. From there, he would crown himself as the king of the Franks in his new capital at Metz. This does not mean that Carloman's job was done, however, as he still had to quash the rebelling lords and disloyal regions of Neustria, a task which would take almost a decade. The period of civil war and consolidation would see large amounts of meddling by the local Umayyad rulers, sponsoring different factions in the civil war in order to weaken whatever state came out on top, and making political plays in Burgundy, carving out some land and tributaries from the contested region. Within Aquitaine itself, a period of Islamization would commence, first starting with the nobles and local leaders, who would be forced to convert in order to maintain their rule. Conversions would begin to filter down into the common populace, centering around cities and high trade areas, with the northern Pyrenees and rural inland regions remaining Catholic. In addition, administrators and scholars would be sent from Iberia, and even some from Arabia proper, to help with the implementation of some Islamic laws, such as a new tax system, which would begin to cement Arabic as an upper-class civil language. Finally, and one of the most key actions made to secure political control, would be the arrangement of political marriages with powerful figures in Aquitaine, beginning efforts to intermix the nobility from Iberia and Aquitaine. Overall, this region would not face too dissimilar treatment to Iberia, and would in many ways become more similar to northern Spain or Catalonia than its northern French neighbour, as through this attempt at consolidation, Arabic, Moroccan, and Andalusi culture would begin to heavily influence the state and its people. Though the Umayyad Empire would be slightly expanded with its conquest of Aquitaine, it would have no large effects on the collapse of the overall Umayyad dynasty, and thus things would play out similarly to our timeline, with the Abbasids seizing much of the former Umayyad land, while fragments of the once great dynasty would remain in control in Iberia. Eventually, in 756, they would found an independent emirate centered around Cordoba. Now, just as in our timeline, the new emir would have to legitimize his power by force, defeating in battles those that attempted to gain their own independence. However, in this timeline, Abd al-Rahman I would also have to contend with Aquitaine, extending his already 25-year-long subjugation campaign by another decade. During this consolidation effort, the Frankish king, likely Carloman's son Drogo, would make a play to expand his influence over Aquitaine, seizing land directly and forming alliances with larger states. Francia would probably not be able to seize the entirety of the territory, however, as the kings would likely be focused on consolidating their own power against the new influential nobility and sparring with Saxon tribes. By the year 800, the Emirate of Cordoba would be fully stabilized, with re-cemented control over most of Aquitaine. Sorry to interrupt the video, but since I hit 5k subscribers, I'm contractually obligated by YouTube to do that annoying thing content creators do. Did you know that almost 90% of my viewers are unsubscribed? To keep up to date with all the crazy videos I have planned, please make sure to subscribe. Also, PS, I have a Discord, the link to which should be in the description of this video. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. One dramatic change that I've yet to mention is that in this timeline, Charlemagne never comes to power, since his grandfather never took control over all of Francia, and instead Carloman's lineage rules the kingdom. Since this could be a scenario all on its own, I won't go into detail about the specific effects of his absence. But for now, the most pressing change is that Francia doesn't manage to conquer most of Western Europe. Instead, due to the powerful Muslim presence in their south, they could focus on influencing and slowly subjugating Germany, placing much more emphasis on the Frankish German elements, shifting what it means to be Frankish and later France to be much more in line with their neighboring Germanic tribes. Perhaps this leads to Frankish remaining as the court language for much longer than our timeline, and more Germanic customs may be officially adopted. This could even culminate in a Latinate French culture in modern France being supplanted by a German one, especially if Frankish conquest in Germania leads to migrations of German peoples deeper into Frankish territory, or if Germanic tribes, just like the Vikings would do a century later, raid into Francia and take land to govern for themselves. Ironically, though being the region which was conquered by an outside power, Aquitaine may resemble our traditional image of France much more than those in the north, as though the Arabs have significant influence over it, just like in Spain, the local Latin-based traditions and language are not fully supplanted by Arab ones. Overall, Aquitaine's culture would resemble a French version of Catalonia, blending elements from French, Spanish, Arab, and the native Occitan culture. Moving into the 9th century, though Aquitaine's territory doesn't provide much value to Cordoba, due to the lack of Charlemagne and the threat of a powerful France, the emirate may begin to experience its golden age almost a century before they historically did, leading to the flourishing of knowledge, trade, and development, which would catapult the power and prestige of Cordoba. This is most relevant to Aquitaine, which would now experience the benefits of the Islamic Golden Age alongside most of Spain, leading to large-scale infrastructure improvements, an increase in trade along its southern coast and rivers, and greater sanitation and life expectancy. Aquitaine's development, in combination with social policy aimed at conversion, would allow for widespread adoption of Islam not only among the upper classes, but also the common populace, with pockets of Christianity still existing in isolated regions. This development would starkly contrast with that of Francia, which would be significantly worse off developmentally due to the civil war, consistent Germanic raids, and a lack of Charlemagne's empire, leaving it destitute when compared to the prosperity in the south. Towards the end of the century, Cordoba may be even able to retake some of its lost Aquitanian territories from Francia, while expanding its influence even further into the western Mediterranean, potentially becoming the dominant trade force in the region. For the rest of Europe, the consequences of this battle going the other way would be dramatic. In this timeline, feudalism doesn't exist in the same way we're familiar with, since there is no Carolingian Empire to forcefully export it to the rest of Europe. Instead, we would likely see local systems develop independently, with places like Germany and Scandinavia being more influenced by tribal and warband loyalty, or in Italy, where many Roman landholding traditions would remain. Frankish feudalism may also take longer to develop overall, since they don't see as large of an expansion in such a quick amount of time. When it does form, its presence would likely be limited to modern-day France, Burgundy, and southern Germany, while also influencing England. The new varying types of feudalism would have massive effects on the development and internal politics of each nation within Europe, in ways which I can't possibly predict. In Italy, due to the lack of the Frankish kings being in a position to protect the Pope from the Lombard states, Rome would likely eventually fall to the Lombards, without the Papal States ever being formed, severely weakening both the temporal power of the Pope and the prestige of Rome, which has now fallen back into the hands of barbarians. In addition, the power of Catholicism is significantly weakened as a whole, as the Franks never commit to a rapid expansion into Germania, and thus the faith grows far slower. Aquitaine and Iberia are mostly dominated by Muslims, threatening Catholics in Western Europe, and the Pope himself is weaker and more subject to the temporal kings who control Rome. This, combined with the increased geographic separation between Catholic states, means that Catholic religious practices are more likely decentralized and include more pagan elements, further weakening the unity of the religion. Another example of the weakening of the spread of Catholicism comes in Bavaria, since the journey of Saint Boniface, the person who helped to cement Catholicism in Bavaria, who in our timeline was officially protected by Charles Martel, could be interrupted by the civil conflict in Francia, combined with the newfound independence of the former Frankish client states. In the newfound weakness of Catholicism, Orthodoxy finds greater success, such as in Great Moravia, which in our timeline was converted to Catholicism due to the influence of the Frankish Empire and German missionaries. However, in this timeline, the influence from the Orthodox Bulgars and lack of a powerful Frankish state nearby, in combination with less Catholic zeal in Bavaria, leads to a conversion of the state to Orthodoxy instead. Similarly, Poland would also likely convert to Orthodoxy instead of Catholicism, since they were influenced by Great Moravia to their south. Overall, Orthodoxy dominates Eastern and even parts of Central Europe, while Catholicism is far weaker and far more fragmented. One of the areas most affected by a weak France is Germania. Within Germany, there would likely be a few minor independent Frankish-influenced states in the south, while in the north, the Germanic tribes would heavily resist any Frankish incursions. It would be dominated by many small tribal-based states and confederations, which would be far more influenced by the Danish, likely at some point adopting Christianity, though far later than in our timeline. In the east of Germania, it's even possible that Orthodoxy spreads, coming from the influence of the Polish and Moravians. In fact, since there's no strong and unified German state, the Poles may be able to form an early empire, seizing the Slavic lands east of the Elbe and influencing the tribes beyond it. Around the 10th century, Cordoba is clearly one of the most powerful European states, potentially even influencing regions of Italy and North Africa, being the center for learning in Western Europe, and declaring themselves as a caliphate in their own right. While Cordoba was thriving, however, Francia would be facing the inverse, as Frankish raids along their northern coast begin to increase in intensity. This, combined with the weaker power of the Frankish state when compared with the kings of West Francia in our timeline, means that it's possible that the lands around Normandy is, similar to our timeline, forcefully seized from the Franks by Viking raiders. However, the extra weakness of the Frankish state may lead to these Vikings, instead of becoming direct vassals of the Franks, forming their own independent kingdoms, similar to that of the Danelaw in England. By the early 11th century, the Caliphate of Cordoba would begin its gradual decline in power, being competed in the Mediterranean by Italian states and being pushed out of North Africa. Though it is likely that the specific collapse of the Caliphate that occurred in our timeline would be butterflied away, sometime in the 11th century or perhaps early 12th century, the Caliphate would probably undergo some sort of crisis, which would severely weaken its power and prestige, eventually leading to its collapse in the early 1100s. Their collapse would provide an opportunity for the Spanish Catholic kingdoms to push south and reclaim Iberian lands just as they did in our timeline. In Aquitaine, the Franks would likely push to establish control over key border territories, especially those that remained Catholic throughout the Muslim occupation. Eventually, a new emirate would be formed by a powerful Aquitanian lord in defense against the oncoming Catholic expansion. Over the next century, the Franks, in collaboration with other minor Catholic states, would slowly, through holy wars, seize areas of Aquitaine and form independent Catholic duchies, while a similar process occurs in Iberia. However, as Muslim power slips in the west, from the east, Islam would strike into the heart of Christian Europe, as the Seljuk Turks would march into Anatolia. With the weakened power of the Pope, and generally more fragmented Catholic Europe, on top of a focus by the major Western states to defeat the Muslim presence closer to their doorstep, would mean that the chances of any large crusade forming are very low. The lack of support from the rest of Europe against the overwhelming Muslim forces could lead to the great city of Constantinople, the city of the world's desire, falling into the hands of the Sultanate of Rome, potentially leading to a collapse of the Byzantines altogether, fragmenting into several smaller states and paving the way for a continued Turkic expansion into the Balkan. By the year 1200, Aquitaine has finally been fully reconquered by the Catholic states, though the population in many regions still remained fervently Muslim. While in Iberia, the remaining Muslim emirate would still be fending off the Catholic Spanish kingdoms in the north, being in a slightly more powerful position than in our timeline. Francia spans much of what we would consider northern France, Germany, and the Benelux, though their Germanic cultural influence spans a much greater distance. Germany, though having several powerful states, has no one unifying kingdom of its own, and soon the idea of any sort of unified Germania or Germanic culture is beginning to fade. Catholicism is far more fragmented in terms of religious practices, with the Pope's station being much weaker due to the influences from temporal states which control and influence Rome. Orthodoxy, on the other hand, has cast a significantly wider net, dominating much of Eastern and Central Europe. However, it is competing with the Islamic states over the fate of Greece and the Balkans. Europe stands fractured, and only time will tell if they can unite fast enough to resist further Islamic incursions. But that's all for this episode, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to see more crazy videos. Comment down below any suggestions you have for future video topics. On screen now is a video which YouTube thinks you'll like. Stay crazy!